All right, welcome back. So we're on part 2 of going through the moral law, the argument for the justification for morality in a theistic worldview. So we have a couple of videos. Frank Turek is going to go through a few things, and then we'll jump back into the presentation. This first one, he's going to deal with objections. So I think that it'll be insightful for you.
Here are the objections you're going to get. And these objections are either confusions, intellectual confusions, or they're outright denials of the will. Okay? The first three are confusions, and then we'll talk about denials. The first objection you'll get is cultures have different values, therefore there is no real absolute objective moral value. It's subjective. One culture has X, another culture has Y. There you go. Proves it. We'll talk about that. Secondly, values have changed. We used to burn witches, for example. We used to have slaves. Now we don't do that anymore. So values have changed. We got to deal with that. Then there's the objection that values conflict. You know, it's the old life raft dilemma. You're on a life raft that's fit for 4 and you have 5 on. If you don't throw somebody off, then everyone's going to die. So what do? They conflict. Or the Nazis come to your door and you're hiding Jews. Are you supposed to tell the truth to the Nazi, or are you trying to save the life? Aren't you supposed to tell the truth? Yeah. You supposed to protect life? Yeah. What do? See, they can't be absolute. They're relative. You got to deal with that. Then finally, we disagree on values. And this is more an issue of denial than it is confusion. We'll talk about that when we get there. Let's go to point 1. Cultures have different values. This is a cow. Everyone can see that? Now, in India, cows are sacred. Where do we get sacred cow from? I assume it's from India. Is that where we get that from? I guess. And they're so sacred to the point that some people starve to death while cows are all around them. Now, obviously here, we have no trouble taking Bossy into the slaughterhouse and having a good steak. So our values, they seem to value cows more than people. What's going on? Right? That's a cow. This is grandma. Now, in India, they don't believe in slaughtering grandma. And neither do we. Right? But why in India won't they slaughter a cow? You know why? Because they think grandma might be in the cow. They believe in reincarnation. See? And they think that some of the souls of their departed loved ones may be in the cow. Now notice, this is not a difference of values. This is actually a difference in understanding. You have an absolute value versus a relative understanding. The value is the same. You're supposed to respect elders and your ancestors. We agree with that, and so do the folks in India. What we have a different understanding in, or understanding of, is where is my ancestor? Where is grandma? If we thought grandma was in the cow, we wouldn't take her to the slaughterhouse, would we? The value is the same. Respect your ancestors. Respect life. What differs is the factual understanding regarding whether or not grandma's in the cow. In India, they don't believe it's right to eat grandma, and neither do we, right? It's not right to eat grandma, okay? So the same value exists. It's just the difference in our understanding of where grandma is. Now, perhaps that's an oversimplification, but you get the idea, okay? Also, sometimes there's a difference between what and how. What do I mean by that? A kiss of greeting is considered polite in some cultures, but in other cultures, it would repel you. Now notice that the value to express respect through a greeting is absolute. Doesn't matter what culture you're in, when you see somebody, you're supposed to greet them. But the difference is in how you express that. what should be done, the greeting is the same, but how it should be done is different. Sometimes it's a hug, sometimes it's a handshake, sometimes it's a kiss. Whatever it is, it's different. They say that Eskimo wives actually express love to their husbands sometimes by chewing his boots before he leaves the igloo. Why? Because you need to warm up those frozen boots. Now, that's an expression of love, but it's in a different culture. If you come downstairs one night, man, and you see your wife chewing your shoes or your boots, you wouldn't think that was an expression of love now, would you? No, but it might be in a different culture. The expression or the value, love, is the same, but how it's expressed is different. The second, that values have changed. We used to burn witches, and we used to have slaves, but we don't anymore, so values have changed. How do we deal with that? Well, first of all, let's point out that this is another indication or another instance of the absolute value versus the relative understanding. Why were witches burned? And by the way, how many witches were burned, as far as we know, in Salem, Massachusetts, way back when? Anyone know? How many? They hanged them, burned them. How many were killed? Anyone know? Anyone have any idea? 5 and 10. As far as we know, I think there were 18. 18 or 19. Now, you would think that from the very popularity of the issue, I mean, everyone seems to know this, that there would be thousands of these people. Now, I'm not saying that 18 or 19 isn't significant, but it's 18 or 19 people, okay? But why were witches burned or hung or killed? Why? Why were they killed? Thought they were evil. The reason they were killed is witch hunters used to believe witches murdered people with their curses. They used to think that witches were murderers, that they could curse people and kill them. We know that that's not the case now. In fact, the moral value of murder did not change. People's understanding of whether witches are murderers changed. Did you like those little guys flying back and forth? I think they'll come out again if we wait. I got to back it up. Here we go. Watch. Yeah, there they go. That guy's trying to catch the witch. Right? What changed? What changed was our factual understanding of whether or not witches were murderers. If they were murderers, maybe they should have died. But if they're not, of course not, we ought not kill them. Now we say, no, witches don't murder people, so let's not kill them. What's the same? The value's the same, life. Life is sacred. What changed is our factual understanding of whether or not a witch was a murderer.
Now, it's important to understand the issues regarding the moral law because it's something that needs to be understood conceptually, philosophically, before you can actually make application to it. So in this next video, Frank's going to be answering a student who's an atheist and at a college. And I do want you to listen closely because he is going to make a point that, and this is typical of a lot of people when they are not properly understanding the issues regarding the moral law. Now, he's going to say that he doesn't have an issue with communism and all this stuff. Now, here's a kid that is at a United States university, exercising freedom of speech, saying what he wants, right? He doesn't realize that he is living within the context of a free country to say what he wants to say and believe what he wants to believe, though he doesn't have an issue with communism, though if he was living in a communist country, those freedoms don't exist. This is part of the problem in our major universities. But anyways, he does talk about his questions on the moral law. I think Turek does a good job answering him, and I think it'll be beneficial.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Kyle.
Hey, Kyle.
I'm an atheist.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Of course, of course. I love hearing these kind of debates and stuff. You asked why would you be an atheist if you possibly might know if God exists? My answer to that question is simple. It's just the fact that there's so many terrible things in the Bible. Like at one point, Jesus says to one of his disciples, "It's great that they're torturing their slaves here, but only lightly. Even though they did nothing wrong, it's great that they're doing it." He doesn't give any reason to why he says that he doesn't do anything. I don't understand why you would want to follow such a God. And my question to you is why you would follow such a God.
Okay, let's not even look at the context of that passage. Let's just assume what you said is 100% true. Okay? As an atheist, why is that wrong?
Why is that wrong?
Yeah.
Morally, I would think that each and every human being here is the same. We all have the same rights. We all have the same wants and needs. I think we all should do the same. I think that we should, especially the God that we should follow, should have higher expectations of knowing such a God.
Okay, but you seem to be assuming that certain things are really right and people have certain rights, even if there is no God. How do you justify that? What's your standard of rightness? If there's
My
no God?
standard of rightness would be a fair society.
What do you mean by fair?
Fair? Everything is equal. I have nothing wrong. I find nothing wrong with a communistic state. That's just my opinion. I don't think it's something you can be afraid of. Everybody seems to be afraid of it.
Okay.
In the United States at least. But that's just my thought of fairness, is the idea that all humans should be the same.
Okay, so it's your thought of fairness. What if Hitler has a different idea of fairness? Is he wrong?
He's not wrong.
Hitler's not wrong.
He is not, well, in a kind of idea that we all have our own opinions. I feel like we should take the utilitarian view and go with what is best for the most amount of us.
Okay, but what do you mean by best?
What would mean the greatest positives for the most amount of people?
Okay, but you're assuming that you're assuming there's a best out there. You're assuming a moral law. Where does that moral law come from if there's no God?
Moral law. I personally just think that human beings should be able to make up their own laws. I mean, each people in time have found their own moral laws, and I think that they become better and better over time.
Better, but you wouldn't even know what better was unless you knew what best was. So I'm asking you, what is your standard of best to say that certain people are closer to the best or better than others? What's the standard? Is it just your opinion, or is there something beyond your opinion which says this is good?
Well, I mean, we've all heard about utopias and a perfect society and things like that. That would be great in a way, but also we've all seen like the books like Huxley's, I believe, I forget what it's called, but he makes a book on this
Great
perfect
world?
society. Yes,
Okay, yeah.
it's that perfect society that everybody's perfect. There's no murder, there's no any of that.
Okay, but the question is, and maybe I'm just not stating it properly, what's wrong with murder if there's no God? Why shouldn't I kill other people to get what I want if there's no God?
Because it doesn't help society.
Why do I care about society?
Because we as a group should worry about society. We should be making the betterment of ourselves.
But Kyle, you're importing a moral law into a frame that has no moral law. As an atheist, you're trying to say there is no God, which means there is no standard of rightness out there. But I'm saying this is my personal standard of rightness, which would mean somebody else could come along like Hitler or Stalin and say, Kyle, if there's no standard beyond neither you or me, then I can do whatever I want, including killing you to get what you have.
It's a very good point. I can see where you're coming from. I don't think that God is needed in a sense I'm not looking for perfection. I don't think anybody here is. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for human beings just to simply work together to better society. I don't really see that need for a perfect identity up above.
Okay, I mean, I'm not saying that an atheist can't be a good person. I'm not saying atheists don't know right from wrong. That's not my point. My point is that it seems to me it's difficult to justify what rightness is if everything is reduced to human opinion. Which human gets to decide, right? It's subjective then, as Levi was saying before. It's just in my subjective mind. If there's not an external reference to say that this is good and this is evil, then we're all just here and we're fending for ourselves. A lot of people will say, and I appreciate your question, it's a very good question. A lot of people will say, well, we need to cooperate to get along, right? Actually, that's not true. Take somebody like Stalin. He cooperated with very few people, just his henchmen, and he killed 20 million people to get what he wanted. And then he died on his deathbed at the age of 74, shaking his fist at God one last time. He never paid for his sins on this life. Okay? So the problem, it seems to me, is we know, and you know right, you know what's right and wrong, and I know it too, and I don't need to believe in God to know that. I just need there to be a God to justify it. Let me put it this way. A lot of atheists say, look, I know right from wrong, and I agree with you, know right from wrong. But that's like saying, I can know what a book says and deny there's an author, which is true. But there would be no book to read unless there was an author. The same is true when it comes to morality. You can know what the right thing to do is and deny there's a God, but there would be no right thing to do unless there was a God. Does that make sense?
I guess I can see your point, yes.
Let me, if I gave you a book, would you read it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Before we go, where's Emma? She's back there somewhere. She'll be at the book table. Let me meet you at the book table and give you a book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So you see what I mean in his responses. He's an honest kid. He's trying to express himself. Unfortunately, he doesn't realize that he is actually contradicting his own views. So let's go to the next one. Let's see.
So lately I've kind of been struggling with pretty much being able to defend, like as a Christian, like we're supposed to, like defend and love others, but how do we even what I think is awesome, like how Jackson, just promoting the law, like exposing the types of bills and stuff to get us involved in government, voting and having that obligation as a Christian. How do we at the same time love and respect, the choices people have without forcing our beliefs onto them and making that into the law?
Well, actually, that's what everyone's trying to do. Everyone's trying to put their own beliefs into the law. All laws legislate morality. The only question is whose morality. So it's impossible not to legislate a moral position. The only question is whose moral position. And so what I try and tell people is, look, when they say, don't impose your morality on me, I say, first of all, why not? Would that be immoral? See, because they're imposing their moral position on us when they say that. But secondly, the better answer is, this isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that theft is wrong, that rape is wrong, that abortion's wrong, that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society is to value that relationship legally over any other sexual relationship. I didn't make any of this up. So it's not my morality. It's not your morality. It's the morality. It's the one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. It's the one the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2 says, the Gentiles are not of the law written on their hearts. So I always point out, everybody's trying to impose a moral position, and I'm not trying to impose my moral position or your moral position. I'm trying to impose the moral position. Now, if I have that wrong, then correct me on it. But I'm trying to do the same thing Thomas Jefferson has done, and the same thing the United States Constitution tries to do.
So, to recap, the cosmological argument deals with the beginning. And the beginning is really the start of what would be material, time, and space. So, the cosmological argument, in the beginning, there's an immaterial, timeless, and spaceless, all-powerful, and this is in order to have a cosmos to begin with. In other words, create everything from nothing. The teleological argument, the design argument, is this all-knowing and intelligent being designed everything and sustains what he has created because he has a purpose. Now in the moral argument where we are, he provides an absolute moral and embodies the perfection of what morality is so that we have a standard in his nature, right? And he's personal. So these describe the God of the Bible really without the Bible. So not using the Bible up until this point, just from how we can think and reason out everything, we would come to the fact that there is an immaterial, timeless, spaceless, all-powerful, all-knowing, intelligent creator that is absolutely morally perfect and personal. We would have to come to that conclusion just based on the fact of these three arguments. So, transitioning to the Bible, the question is, what God best fits the description of the three arguments for God's existence? Okay, so only a theistic God could have created separate from himself, which really limits us globally to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the only monotheistic religions. So we have those as choices to choose from. So Judaism and Islam have no current verification of God's fingerprints, which are miracles, to validate them as God speaking through them now and God communicating. So Judaism once did, but now Christianity has the miraculous verification through the apostles. Islam never did. So, and that's further discussed when we get into the PowerPoint on miracles, which we'll get into next. But the Bible gives specifics on how God manages his creation, right? So we'll look at specific verses in the Bible which provide support for the three arguments for the existence of a theistic God, right? So God created the universe, cosmological argument, which means that God is obviously necessary and powerful. He has to exist in order to create the universe. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. John 1:3, all things were made by him, talking about Jesus, and without him was not anything made that was made. And then he designed his creation, which shows that he is intelligent. Proverbs 20:12 says, the hearing ear, the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Now there's many other verses, but I'm just picking a few under each heading so that we can see how the Bible reflects this. Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And God created man with a conscience. This is where the moral law is implanted on our hearts. So Romans 2:14 and 15, Paul says, when the Gentiles who do not have the law, and so he's differentiating Gentiles from Jews at this point, and he's just saying that there are people that will be judged, but they're judged based on how God has put the moral law in their hearts through their conscience. So when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, now we're not talking about a refined, very sensitive conscience, understanding the details that are given by God in the Bible. Otherwise, you wouldn't need the Bible at all. But there are basics that are there. And obviously, people disagree on certain aspects of morality. That's to be expected. However, there are basics of right and wrong, and some of the things that we've gone through to show that people, even without the Bible, by nature do things that are written in the Bible within the law. They show the work of the law, Paul says, written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, accusing or else excusing them. That's why you do something that is in violation of what God has put on your heart, and then your conscience is guilty. It tells you that you should have done something different. And that's what we're dealing with regarding that command. So God sustains his creation. So there's a uniqueness here, right? Psalm 104 says he causes the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth food from the earth. So God is unique in caring for his creation. Colossians 1:17 says he, talking about Jesus, is before all things. In other words, has the priority of position as the creator, and in him all things consist, or literally are held together. You want to know why the atoms act the way they do, but nobody really knows why? That's why. God manages his creation, which means that he is engaged with it, right? Isaiah 40 verse 22 said, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in." So God is engaged with his creation. He is continuing to stretch out the heavens, and that's why we see an expanding universe and the circle of the earth. How would Isaiah know that the globe was round? Always science eventually does catch up with the Bible. Psalm 104:2 says, who cover yourself with light as a garment, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. So he's managing creation and finely tuning it, as we saw in the design argument, because that stretching has to be at an exact rate, because if it varied, even in a minuscule way, the universe would cease to exist. And God is eternal. His creation is finite. God is transcendent. He is beyond creation. He is not part of it. Hebrews 1:10 and 11, "You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain." God is eternal, not man. In the sense, now we will go on to live forever because God has created us, and even beyond this life, we will spend eternity either with God in heaven or apart from him in eternal separation and eternal punishment. But only God was prior to the creation. In the beginning, he laid the foundations of the earth. 1 Peter 1:24 and 25, "All flesh is as grass, all the glory of man is the flower of the grass. The grass withers, its flower falls away, and the word of the Lord endures forever." So puts in perspective how fragile life actually is. When you're younger, you think you're going to live forever physically, and then you get older, you realize that things are coming to a close. So as we go on.
So this summer I got to work with a guy who is a wildly intellectual man. He was an awesome dude. He was a staunch atheist, and he loved to challenge Christians on their thoughts. Year in, year out, they would come in and he'd just ask a bunch of questions, and a really cool guy. Anyway, so he came into work one week, just day after day, just continually pounding away at this Romans 1 argument, in the sense that, okay, if God is just, and if God is righteous, and if he's revealed himself, and if he has revealed his wrath on all unrighteousness, then how come God only revealed himself in Christ to a small little pocket of civilization in the Middle East? And why were there not little other gods popping up all over, on North American continent, the South American continent, things like that? And I didn't really know what to say. I was like,
Well, notice that this is a moral question. What he's implying is that God would be immoral for revealing this to such a small group of people. You might ask him, well, why would that be immoral? Yeah. Oh, because then some people can't get saved. Well, how do you know that they can't get saved? How do you know that? I might ask him. And it could be that those that never hear the gospel wouldn't have believed it anyway, right? I mean, God knows that. So this is a variation of the question, what about those that have never heard? Yeah. It's a moral question. It's trying to say that God isn't up to some sort of moral standard that he should be up to. If your friend was saying, if I was God, I'd do it a different way. Well, you're not God.
Okay? And if God wants all people to be saved, as the scriptures do say, and he is all loving, as the scriptures say, then he's going to do whatever he can to get people saved. But if people don't want to be saved, if people don't want to be in his presence, then God won't force them to be. In fact, I was at the University of Michigan doing a presentation, or doing a debate actually, with an atheist by the name of Eddie Tabash. And we had the opportunity to question one another. And Eddie Tabash asked me, he said, my mother was a survivor of the Holocaust. She lived a life full of pain and suffering. Toward the end of her life, someone told her about Jesus, gave her the gospel, but she rejected it and then she died. Is she in hell right now? I said, Eddie, I don't know where your mother is now. I don't know if your mother had a deathbed conversion or not. But if she didn't accept Christ before she died, then God is too loving to force her into heaven against her will. You see, because the assumption is that everybody wants to go to heaven. That's not true. Who's in heaven? Jesus is in heaven. Well, there have been people running from Jesus their entire lives. What's he going to do in the afterlife? Go, whoa, whoa, where are you going? You're with me now. How would that be loving? You say, wait a minute, Frank, what about all this business about hell then? Well, I asked the ladies at the University of Michigan this question. So ladies, I'm going to ask you this question. This is just for the ladies. Ladies, have you ever had a man pursue you whom you did not want to date? Some of you are going, yeah, and he's sitting next to me right now. He will not leave me alone. In fact, whenever I ask that question, the ladies always giggle and the men look at their shoes. Is she looking at me right now? Well, suppose that this man keeps asking you out, he keeps asking you out, and you get to the point, ladies, where you say, look, I like you, but only as a... Why don't you just stick the knife in and turn it? Every man has heard the dreaded friend rejection. Ladies, if you ever get the dreaded friend rejection, or gentlemen, if you ever get the dreaded friend rejection, move on. She's not interested. In fact, shocking news for you, she doesn't even like you as a friend. Because if she did, ladies, don't give me that. If you really did like him as a friend, you'd be interested, but you're not. You're just trying to let him down easy. Well, suppose this doesn't deter him. He continues to pursue. He continues to pursue. He gets to the point in the conversation where he says, I love you so much, I'm going to force you to love me. Ladies, what should you do? Run, screaming from the building. Can he force you to love him? No, love by definition must be freely given. If he truly did love you, ladies, what would he do? He would leave you alone. That's what God does for us. He sends us cards, letters, and flowers. He sends us creation. Everybody has that. He sends us conscience. Everybody has that. He sends us Christ. He may send us a missionary. He may send us a TV broadcast, a radio broadcast. In some Muslim countries now, Jesus is appearing to Muslims who are close to the gospel because they want to be saved. But if he does all that, and you keep saying, no, 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 then God will give you up to your own desires. He will leave you alone. And that's what hell is. It's separation from God. So the question that your friend is asking is assuming a moral standard, and it's not even clear that God is immoral for doing what he's doing, because if God wants all people to be saved, he knows who will be saved and who wouldn't be saved. And he can get them the word even if we can't get them the word. But again, that friend, if he's an atheist, he has no moral standard by which to judge the God of the Bible as immoral.
Yeah.
All right, so back to from the Bible what we know. God intervenes in his creation, meaning he's engaged, right? The Lord said, I will destroy man whom I created from the face of the earth. Now that was certainly being engaged in judgment, but God is engaged. And that's important for us to understand as we move into miracles. Genesis 22, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, do not lay your hand on the lad. That's when Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac. And God has a plan for his creation. He's purposeful. Revelation 21, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven, the first earth passed away. And This is God's ultimate plan for us as believers. And he is separate from his creation. He's non-contingent, which means he doesn't require creation to exist in order for him to exist. He is separate. So Numbers 23:19, God is not a man that he should lie, neither the son of man that he should repent. Isaiah 55:9. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And I think a lot of times we struggle with that, but we cannot think exactly the way God does. We can't know what he knows. So we need to trust what he says.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
Stone.
Stone?
Yes.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. I'm another person in the audience who's seen just about everything that you've put out. And
That's too bad, man. You really ought to get out more.
Regardless, a lot of what...
No, I appreciate it. I'm just kidding.
A lot of what you speak about tends to center around absolute truth, absolute certainty, absolute morality. Why does something have to be absolute to be useful?
Why does something have to be absolute to be what?
To be useful. Why does morality have to be 100% set in stone for us to be able to act on it? Why do we have to be 100% sure that the universe is in such...
Were you on our blog?
I was not, no.
Because somebody just asked that question just recently. Why does it have to be useful? Well, the question I would ask, and forgive me because this is the way we try and figure out the assumptions of the question, what do you mean by useful?
You have said in the past that if morality is not 100%, then when we say that it's wrong to hurt babies, that's just an argument, a difference of opinion between me and someone who murders babies. Why do we have to be 100% sure on, for instance, morality to say that something
okay,
is
I think I see where you're coming from,
effectively
Stone.
wrong?
Yeah, no, the issue is not epistemology. That's how we know something. The issue is ontology. Why does something exist? And I'm saying that if there is no God, there is no ultimate standard of rightness. We can argue about how we know that ultimate standard of rightness, whether it's written on our hearts by God, if macroevolution were true, did evolution give it to us, did our society teach it to us, did our parents teach it to us, whatever. Those are all epistemological questions. I'm asking the question ontologically, where does this standard we call goodness come from if there is no God?
And I'm saying that you don't need a standard of goodness external to ourselves. What I'm saying is that at no point is it relevant to say, where does this come from absolutely? Saying that something exists absolutely is essentially saying that you can't think of a way in which it would come to being by something else.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Again, you're dealing with an epistemological question here again. If there is no God, why is it wrong to torture babies for fun?
It is wrong to torture babies for fun because, at least I define right and wrong as what increases human happiness and
okay, but that's you though. What if Stalin comes along and says, what will increase my human happiness is to kill you, take your stuff? Why is he wrong if he does that?
He's not wrong, Court. That's what I'm saying. We don't have to be objectively right in order to make claims.
No, you don't have to be objectively right to make claims, but are you telling me Stalin was not objectively wrong?
I'm saying that you can't be objectively wrong. If all of us in this room believe that it is wrong to commit atrocities, whatever we define them as, if we all agree that Hitler was wrong for committing the Holocaust, then we can say that it was wrong as long as we have a coherent definition of what right and wrong are.
I know, I'm asking you what the standard is. And if there's no standard outside of us, then it's just mere human preference.
Yes, and human preference is it's a valid thing to base objections and laws on, provided that we all agree to them.
Whoa, why do we have to agree? If Stalin doesn't agree and he has more power, is he morally wrong for doing so?
He's morally wrong according to a popular definition, yes.
Okay, so you're saying now that the majority gets to decide what's morally right and wrong.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, so then if you're in Nazi Germany and you decide to murder Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and Jehovah's Witnesses, that's now morally right?
Yes, absolutely. It was right for the Jews to come through and terrorize half the Middle East in the Old Testament. I mean, at some point we have to admit that what we hold as right and wrong are subjective.
Okay, well, Stone, you can take that position. If you want to take that position, you're biting the bullet to be an atheist. And I commend you for being consistent like Nietzsche was. I just think that that's wrong, because any premise that you come up with to try and say atheism is true or morality is subjective is weaker than the basic intuition I have that torturing babies for fun or murdering Jews, homosexuals, and gypsies is wrong.
All right. Well, it was a pleasure hearing you.
It was. Stone. Thank you. It's a pleasure hearing you too. Thank you.
All right, so let's summarize where we're at right now. Morality is not determined, it's discovered. So if I try to, like Stone did in the video, just declare something's right or wrong, it's my opinion, I can't determine it as an absolute. I can only have it as an opinion or a preference, which is really valueless in the sense that it will benefit everybody, because if I decide that I want to do something different than what somebody else feels is beneficial and it hurts them, if I have the capability of doing it in an atheistic world, then that's just what I do, and that's what I determine the benefit is. So we need to understand morality is prescriptive, not descriptive. So it's not determined, it's discovered. I discover what morality is. I don't determine it. It has to be determined somewhere else beyond me, and that's where God comes in, because the absolutes of what's right and wrong is grounded in his nature. So morality isn't determined by majority vote. That doesn't make it correct. If 51% of the people said that we should kill a whole bunch of certain groups within a country, like Hitler did or Stalin or anything else, that does not make it right just because people decide that. Look, if 99% of the people or 100% of the people said we think 2 + 2 is 5, it doesn't make it 5. I mean, I don't know how much clearer we can be on that. The moral standard doesn't change. It's objective and not subjective. Remember, objective is to the object, right? Subjective is to me. So that's the difference. We saw that in the first part in the little cartoon video. I think they did an excellent job on that. Morality is grounded in the object we know as God's unchanging nature. So you want to know what ultimate morality is, then you have to understand God's nature. That's where it's grounded. Thus, it's unchanging because God doesn't change, and it's authoritative because God is sovereign over all creation, and therefore unaffected by our opinions or votes. That's the bottom line. Without an unchanging objective standard, therefore, all moral questions are reduced to humans' opinions, like we said, and atheists can have a moral standard. We're not saying that atheist people are all immoral. Atheists can have a moral standard that they live by, like the kid was saying in the video. They just can't justify it, and they can't impose it. See, that's the problem. You can't impose something that is not an imperative. Otherwise, you're forcing somebody to do what you have a preference to, which everybody would disagree with that, unless they find agreement with what they're being forced to do. And again, now you're back to trying to find majority vote to make something the truth, and that's not how it works. In other words, there is no objective moral basis for their judgments because they can't justify it. The atheist position on morality is inconsistent and self-defeating. It will always be. There's no way to get around that. Apart from the existence of God, talk of morality is absurd and has no basis in logic or reason. Materialism, in other words, only natural law exists, cannot breed non-material thought. No matter how much people would like that to be, that's never going to happen. You cannot, from just the material biology, create immaterial thinking. Just because we do that does not mean that's where it came from. No different than nature cannot produce nature. The natural law cannot produce itself. It doesn't exist to do that in the beginning, which is why you need the theistic God. If all we are is chemicals, this is Francis Crick, who is co-discoverer of DNA, Richard Dawkins, and others. How much does logic weigh, and where is it, and how do we put it under a microscope? In other words, if there's things that are claimed to be part of the physical world, like many atheists try to claim that, your thinking is physical, it's only the chemical reactions in your brain, then how do we examine the logic molecule? Where does that come from? What's the chemical composition of reason, right? Why do we put people away for murder if they're only doing what their chemical reactions are telling them to? They're only reacting to the chemical makeup and not actual morality. As Richard Dawkins says, he says, dancing to their DNA, in other words, DNA neither cares nor knows, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. This is from River Out of Eden. This is Dawkins' view of life. Darwinian view of life, excuse me. Conclusion, there is no difference between a rapist and a loving husband with this kind of worldview. And Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot are not different than loving caregivers because there's no way to define them as different. Now, I know that this kind of sticks in the craw of atheists, but unfortunately, that's to be a consistent atheist, that's the position that they would have to take, as detestable as that is. Though people may object to Hitler and others, they can't be considered wrong, for there is no objective moral standard to measure them by that is right. And you can't know what's right unless God exists. And again, you have this transcendent law that is imposed on us from the outside. That doesn't exist without God. The most powerful position an atheist can take is an opinion and preference that they wouldn't do the same thing. In other words, the same morality based on emotion. So they may not want certain things to happen, but they just can't justify it or call it right and wrong. They can just say, I would not like that to happen. Morality requires God. All people have a moral standard that is outside themselves. This is shown in how their conscience works. There are things that people know are wrong that they wouldn't have done to them or someone they love. And they follow a moral standard and try to justify it, but they can't without the existence of God, the moral lawmaker. Scripture gives us the indication of this, right? Paul, in reference to conscience, tells us in Romans 2 that we quoted earlier, how God will judge Gentiles with who are without the Mosaic law. He says, for when Gentiles do not have the law, by nature do the things in the law, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Final points. We find the absolute and unchanging moral standard in the theistic God. God's moral laws are not capricious or arbitrary, but express the nature and character of God, which is unchanging, absolute, and infinite. God's nature is expressed in the laws and commands we find in the Bible. They reflect his nature. So we may see different laws under a different covenant. In the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, God was managing a nation. In the New Covenant, he's managing a body of believers. The church is not a nation. The church doesn't have a king. The church doesn't go out to war. The church doesn't do any of that. Now, the nation of Israel was designed for a different purpose than the church is. The church is designed to grow, reflect Jesus Christ, to develop its relationship, to walk in the truth, and to be a witness to the world. The nation of Israel, though designed to be a witness to the world, because all of God's expression is, they're also to be protected as a nation to bring the Word of God and the Messiah of God into the world. So they had to be dealt with differently. So, for example, in the Old Testament, you have people that committed blasphemy, they were stoned. In the New Testament, in the church, nobody gets stoned. If somebody is committing blasphemy and they won't repent, then you ask them to leave the church, but you certainly don't take up stones to stone them. So different covenants will express the same truths in different ways that God tells us to, but it's because he has a different purpose in the group that he's dealing with in that way. Truth, or what corresponds to reality, is an expression of the nature of God in the natural laws and design of the universe. So the universe is orderly, God is orderly. That's why the universe is orderly. We can describe things in mathematical precision. We see things are goal-directed. We see things are laid out in an order because there is an orderer. That's why. It didn't just happen like that by accident. God is the ultimate reality, and he is the source of all truth, and moral standard expresses his perfection. So that's what we see. The universe is unified in the natural laws created by God, and these are in harmony with his character. So this is why what we understand from the moral law, the cosmological argument, design argument, we can argue back to God's existence because we see the effects, and God has provided us the ability to reason from. We certainly understand cause and effect, but now we're doing effect back to cause, and God is the ultimate source or cause. Number 6, God is the ultimate infinite standard and source of righteousness and goodness. That's why we can know where we're at in relation to that, and whether something is good or not can be measured. God's commands are consistent with his moral nature and point us to the final cause or objective goal of our lives. They and we are not arbitrary. God has a plan for all. Since God's character is the standard of goodness, his preferences are extensions of his character and not arbitrary decrees. God just doesn't say, I think I'll have man do this or do that. He's very, very specific because he has a goal in mind, and they're all representative of his character. He's holy, which means there's him, and then he is separate from all his creation. And so in that, he does not want the corruption that has invaded the creation to represent him in any way. God himself doesn't change, therefore the standard of morality, truth, and goodness does not change. That's where the absoluteness comes from. Since the standard is internal to God, he is not dependent on anything outside of himself in order to accomplish any of those things or to be that. He is not contingent, as we talked about. So here's the Romans 2 argument. Again, we can't hear it enough, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves. So any standard man imposes on himself or others is a law by which they comprehend right and wrong. If I say to you, hey, that's not right for you to do, well, I've just established a standard. Whether I know God or I don't know God, I will be judged by that standard that I know. So if I say, hey, it's wrong for you to steal, Well, if I steal, then I'm violating the standard or the law that I set up that I understand to be wrong. So this is what Romans 2 is talking about. Paul goes on, he says, who, talking about the Gentiles, show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or excusing them. So man's conscience is not created by himself or a product of evolution, but is given to all humans by God, which is why it's not controllable, only ignorable. Important point. I can't control my conscience. I can't make it say certain things are okay and other things are not, because that's why it creates guilt when I do something I sense is wrong. So in saying that, I can ignore it. I can harden myself to it. As the Bible says, I can create it so that I get callous and it becomes less sensitive, but it never goes away because it's part of the image of God that God put in us at creation. But it's not controllable by me. I need to respond to it properly as it's dictating to me, but I can only ignore it. I can't control it in that way. The foundation of the moral argument. So there we have it.
Yes.
Let's kind of wrap up with this last question, unless someone else has one during it. There's a lot of heat in our culture today to accept the sexual, I guess, no authority in the sexual revolution. Just continuing and how do we as Christians show love, tenderness, compassion, truth, grace in the midst of people that want to see same-sex marriage verified by the government and moving in that direction, and basically the dissolvement of the nuclear family? How do we engage that? Not just pointing to the Bible, but talking about some of the other parts of your book, Correct, Not Politically Correct, which is a life-changing book if you read it. And I know you don't have any today, but they can order it online.
Yeah.
But just a real quick kind of overview of Correct, Not Politically Correct and the culture that we live in today.
Well, let me give you some questions you can ask rather than making statements. Because if people ask you questions on this, it's going to be volatile, right? If they disagree with you. So suppose somebody asks you a question like, what do you think about transgenderism? Or what do you think about same-sex marriage or homosexuality? Or any of these questions that are hot-button social issues. You should ask a question back. And here's the question. Do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Why do you want to ask that question? Because the other person's probably going to have to say yes, right? Especially if they're on the other side of this issue. They always talk about tolerance, inclusion, diversity, and all these things, right? So what you're going to say is, after they say yes, you'll say great. Because if I give an opinion that's different from yours, you'll tolerate it then, right? Because you only tolerate things you disagree with. You don't tolerate things you agree with, right? You agree with them. The only way you can tolerate something is if you disagree with it. So if you say, do you consider yourself a tolerant person? By the way, all this is in the app, okay? So if you forget this, it's right there in the app. So if someone asks you about this, you immediately go to your app. Hang on. How do I respond? Okay. Do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Your next question ought to be, if they say, well, I think same-sex marriage is a good thing, or transgenderism, your first question ought to be, what do you mean by that? What do you mean good? How do you define good? What is good? Right? They're going to have a very difficult time defining good without reference to God. Why? Because there's nothing good or bad unless there's a standard. And if it's just them, it's just their standard, who said that's good? There's got to be a standard outside of us. So you're saying this is good for society. What do you mean by good? Who said? People have rights. What do you mean by a right? Where do rights come from? Because if there's no God, there's no right to anything. There's not only no right to same-sex marriage, there's no right to natural marriage. There's no right to anything. There's no rights. What are you talking about, rights? Governments don't give rights. Governments protect rights according to our Declaration of Independence. If government gives you your rights, that means if a new government shows up, you no longer have them? No, rights are something you have regardless of what the government says. That's the point. So you ask the question, what do you mean by that? Next question, how did you come to that conclusion? Or or what evidence do you have for your position, in other words? In other words, you're looking for evidence for why they believe what they believe. Try and figure out where the other person's coming from and see if they can support their position. Okay? Because when somebody says something, it's not your job to refute what they say, it's their job to support what they say. You see the point? Don't take the burden on yourself to refute what they say. Let them support it. And you'll realize that pretty soon most people don't have much intellectual justification for their position. They just heard a slogan that they like. And they don't realize the slogan isn't true. And they pair it with other slogans they know about. They're mutually contradictory. And as soon as you ask them for evidence, then they're out of the ability to support their case. In fact, some of you are old enough to remember this. Only a few of you are probably. But you remember when people used to come to your door and knock on your door and try and sell you a vacuum? Remember that? And then vacuum would be like $1,500. But after he sucked all those mites out of your couch, you go, I need it! Right? Those bugs are living in my couch, right? I mean, they put a pretty hard sell on you remember? Well, imagine if somebody came to your door, knocked on your door and said, I'm selling this vacuum, let me show it to you. And you go, you think that's good? You go back into your closet, you take out your vacuum, and you go, look at this thing! And he wants to buy your vacuum now. You think that's going to happen? No! Before he's interested in your vacuum, he's got to begin to doubt his own vacuum. Right? Before someone's going to accept your worldview, they may need to doubt their own worldview. So ask them for justification for their worldview and see what they say. Chances are they're not going to be able to support it other than throwing slogans at you. And then you ask, what do the slogans mean? What does that mean? So, do you consider yourself a tolerant person? What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And then the fourth question is a nice way for you to provide some evidence back. And that's when you can say something like, have you ever considered? And then fill in the blank. Have you ever considered that there are no rights to anything unless there's a standard beyond humanity? And that standard would be what we would call God's nature. Have you ever considered that? I mean, it's a nice way of saying it back, right? Now, these questions, by the way, particularly, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? You can use for any topic, not just questions about Christianity or sexuality, right? I mean, parents, you should use this with your kids, right? Your kid calls you one night and says, Dad, I'm not going to be home by 11 like you want me to. First question, what do you mean by that? Second question, how did you come to that conclusion? Third question, have you ever considered, if you're not home by 11, you're grounded for 2 weeks. Be right home, Dad! By the way, husbands, never, ever use these questions on your wife. Okay? Because if she calls you an idiot, don't say, what do you mean by that? You know, how'd you come to that conclusion? Right? She's going to have a list 25 years long. And you're toast. Don't try it. So I would ask questions. And I would try and get to, in fact, I was at the University of Michigan and somebody asked me, what do you think about homosexuality? You know what I said? It doesn't matter what I think. I'm not the moral arbiter of the universe. I don't make that. It's not my morality. If you're asking me what the Bible says, I'll tell you what the Bible says, and here's why. In fact, one thing you can say, regardless of what the issue is you can say the culture wants us to think that sex is just physical. Everyone in this room knows that's false. If sex is just physical, why is it worse if somebody rapes you than if somebody just physically assaults you? Because sex isn't just physical. It's emotional. It's spiritual. It's biological. It's psychological. There's a lot more than just the physical act. And yet the culture wants us to treat it like it's just a physical act. It's not just a physical act. People get how do I say this? People sometimes get hurt beyond recovery when it comes to sex. Beyond recovery. Not just physically, but emotionally. Can't recover. Because it's not just physical. And yet, everyone in our culture wants to treat it as just physical, but look at the state our culture's in now. Look at the state the individuals are in. Not just when it comes to physical disease. I just saw just a few days ago that the STDs are at an all-time high, but the emotional. You know what the sexual revolution has brought us? probably more than half the people in this room have been scarred by the sexual revolution. On just one aspect of it, and that is divorce. People in here have been scarred by divorce. Scarred. And what brought us that? The sexual revolution. That sex is just all about romantic feelings, and once those feelings go away, you get to do whatever you want. There's somebody else out there that you deserve now. So much for the kids, so much for the other person. People are scarred. And we skip along like there's nothing wrong with it. And by the way, the church cares more about homosexual relationships than our own. We have to start caring more about no-fault divorce than just, you know what brought us same-sex marriage was no-fault divorce. Why? Because we got into this mindset that relationships are just about emotional romance. And once that emotional romance, once those feelings go away, you're free to go to anyone else. Well, if marriage is all about emotional romance, then why not just marry somebody of the same sex? What does it matter? It's nothing to do with kids, nothing to do with gender. It's just romance. That's what brought us here. And the church has been the one that's been quiet while the sexual revolution just goes right on.
One more by Frank, and then we'll call it a day.
The way I get into spiritual conversations, normally with strangers, is if I'm on an airplane, which I'm on a lot, is I normally ask them, after I greet them, hey, what do you do? And normally they'll tell me what they do. And then to reciprocate, they'll ask me what I do. And I will say, well, I'm an author. I've written a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And if there's any interest there, then I know the conversation can continue. If they kind of shut down, I know no matter what I say, we're not going anywhere. Now, not every one of our viewers here can say, I've written a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, or I've written some book. But you might be able to say something else. Oh, I work for so-and-so, or I do this, or I do that, or I'm part of this vibrant community at such and such a church, and I do this. You can see if there's any spiritual interest there. There's no sense pushing a rope. If you put out some spiritual hint and they don't bite on it, there's no sense you trying to pursue that line of conversation. You will just annoy them. So see if there's some openness by subtly bringing up topics that they may be interested in, and see if they pursue that line of conversation. If they don't, then you're not going to get anywhere with them anyway.
So I think that was a good thing to end with. Now, in the previous little video that he was answering the question on tolerance, the book was mentioned, Correct, Not Politically Correct. So he authored that. That was a number of years back, where he talked about same-sex issues and the government. So you can pick that book up if you're interested. And also, he also co-authored I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with Norman Geisler, as well as Legislating Morality. And he authored himself the book that's called Stealing from God, that we actually quote from. So anyways, with that, that ends the moral argument. We went over time here, and we're just over an hour, so I'm going to end the video now. And may God continue to richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.